Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk.
Great to be here.
Today, we're going to dig into the latest on the Trump-era trade policies. Lots happening there.
Yeah, definitely. We've got statements from, Treasury, commerce officials, plus market analysis, international reactions, all from late April 2025.
Right. And this isn't just like a numbers update. We want to unpack what this actually means.
Yeah.
For business, the world stage, how people are seeing things.
Exactly. More than just the headlines.
Okay, so first up, let's look at the markets. There was all this tariff talk, but the S&P 500, it had that 6-day winning streak, right? End of April?
It did, yeah. But there was still some chatter about April maybe ending in the red overall, despite that run.
So kind of mixed signals. What was pushing stocks up then, if not pure confidence in the trade stuff?
Well, it seems like a lot of it was driven by stock buybacks, actually. Post-earnings season, you had big companies, think Alphabet, big banks, pharma, sitting on cash. And instead of pouring it into, say, major new projects or capital expenditure, they were buying back their own shares.
Okay, so pumping up their own stock price, basically. What does that tell us? Is it like a lack of better options or?
It suggests caution, definitely. I mean, you've still got this uncertainty hanging around, like with the semiconductor tariffs. The baseline might be around 10%, but nobody knows for sure what's next.
Right.
So committing to huge long-term investments, companies are hesitant. These buybacks can give the market a boost, sure, but it might not be, fundamentally driven by strong economic optimism tied directly to trade policy just yet.
Yeah, that makes sense. Uncertainty killed big plans. Okay, so shifting to actual trade deals. Commerce Secretary Retnick mentioned a first deal is imminent. Sounds like maybe India.
India seems like the most likely candidate, yeah. Their economy is quite domestically focused, and they're less dependent on exporting to the U.S. compared to, say, China.
So maybe an easier win to start with, less controversial.
Potentially, yes. It could be framed as a positive first step. How much impact a U.S.-India deal has on the really big picture, though?
Well, that's another question. Okay. Now, Trump's view on tariffs. The sources suggest he sees them as leverage, right? But he's also wary of inflation kicking in later.
Exactly. It looks like a strategic calculation. Use the tariffs to get concessions now, sort of before they start causing widespread price increases.
Because inflation could hurt politically, maybe benefit the Democrats.
That seems to be the thinking. So it's a gamble hoping the leverage gained outweighs the potential inflation risk, at least in the short to medium term.
It's a tightrope walk, definitely. Now, about China. We heard some really big numbers about potential job losses there due to new U.S. tariffs. Millions, potentially.
Yeah, the figures mentioned were pretty staggering. Up to 10 million jobs potentially at risk with new tariffs. Even if tariffs were reduced, it could still be around 5 million.
Wow. And the logic behind that is the trade imbalance.
That's the core argument. The U.S. imports vastly more from China than it exports to China, like 5 times more. So the U.S. consumer market holds significant leverage.
We buy more of their stuff than they buy of ours, basically.
Right. And it's not just goods. The U.S. perspective also stresses China's ongoing need for Western tech experience talent. That's another point of leverage.
Gotcha. Okay, so trade is one piece. But the Trump administration's policy was often called that three-legged stool.
Yeah.
What were the other legs again?
Tax policy and deregulation. Trade, tax, deregulation. The idea is they work together.
How so?
Well, trade policy aims to make the U.S. more attractive for production. Tax cuts are meant to incentivize investment here. And deregulation is supposed to cut the cost of doing business.
Okay, let's break those down. Tax cuts, they're pushing to make the 2017 cuts permanent. Why is that the focus?
Certainty. That's the main goal. Make the rules predictable for businesses, for individuals, so they can plan long term. Remove that question mark.
And encourage investment, I guess.
Exactly. Plus, there's talk about specific relief for workers' tips, overtime, Social Security, even car payments mentioned.
And for businesses, specifically, there was talk about full expensing.
Yeah.
What is that?
Right. Full expensing for equipment, potentially retroactive to January 20th. Basically means a company can deduct the entire cost of new equipment in the year they buy it.
Instead of spreading it out over years.
Well, correct. It's a big upfront tax break, makes buying machinery or tech much more attractive right now, and they're even considering it for building new factories.
To encourage bringing manufacturing back, reshoring.
That's the clear goal, yes. A major incentive to build here.
Okay, makes sense. Now, deregulation, the third leg, described as an unseen massive tax cut. How does removing regulations save consumers money? That connection seems less direct.
The argument is regulations cost businesses money, paperwork, compliance, hoops to jump through. Reduce those burdens, and businesses should have lower operating costs.
And then those savings get passed on.
That's the hope. Lower prices, more competition. The effects are expected maybe Q3, Q4. It takes time to filter through, assuming it does.
Right. And the philosophy tying this all together seems to be economic security is national security.
That's fundamental. The idea is a strong domestic economy, especially in critical areas. Semiconductors, pharma, steel is essential for national security.
Can't rely on other countries for the really important stuff.
Exactly. Relying too much on foreign supply chains is seen as a vulnerability. So onshoring is key.
Which links back to things like potential auto tariffs too, right? An executive order was mentioned.
Yes. The goal there would be pretty straightforward. Push car companies hard to make more cars in the U.S. It fits that whole reshoring domestic manufacturing picture.
So the overall message being pushed is trust this formula. It worked before, it'll work again. Confidence in the future.
That's definitely the narrative. Trust the plan, a focus on these core economic principles.
But we also heard businesses are still hesitant about long-term investment because of tariff uncertainty. That seems like a direct conflict.
It absolutely is a tension point. You offer tax certainty with one hand, but the trade uncertainty kind of takes away with the other, doesn't it?
Yeah. How can you plan a billion-dollar factory if you don't know what tariffs will look like next year?
Precisely. So while tax cuts and deregulation might nudge investment, the unpredictable nature of trade policy, especially tariffs, acts as a major brake on those really big long-term commitments.
Even though the ultimate stated goal is making the U.S. the best place for business. Low taxes, low regulation, low energy costs, no tariffs. That last part seems tricky right now.
It's a very ambitious vision, yes. Achieving all of that simultaneously, particularly the no tariffs part, given current policies, is, well, a huge challenge.
Okay, let's shift to this Amazon incident. They were thinking about labeling tariff costs on products, and the White House reacted strongly.
Yeah, that caused a bit of a firestorm. The report was Amazon planned to show customers exactly how much of a product's price was due to tariffs.
And the reaction was negative.
Very. The White House reportedly saw it as hostile and political. Amazon denied that was the motive, of course, but it raises a really interesting point.
Which is?
If the tariffs are supposed to be good, why not be transparent about the cost? Why the pushback against showing consumers that specific cost?
And the Treasury official, or Trump spokesperson, fired back pretty hard, didn't they? Mentioning past issues.
They did. They questioned the timing, why now, why not, during peak Biden inflation. And they brought up a Reuters report about Amazon supposedly cooperating with Chinese propaganda in the past.
Wow, pulling no punches.
No. It was framed as questioning Amazon's motives, suggesting maybe they weren't acting in good faith towards American interests.
And this whole thing is then used as another reason to buy American.
Seems like it, yeah. Reinforcing the message. See, these tariffs on foreign goods do hit your wallet, so we need to make things here, onshore supply chains.
But back to that transparency question. What do analysts say? If tariffs work, show the cost, right?
That's exactly the criticism from analysts. If the policy is sound and the benefits outweigh the costs, transparency shouldn't be threatening. The strong reaction suggests maybe the direct cost to consumers is a sensitive issue.
Okay, let's zoom out now. International relations. How is the rest of the world viewing all this? It sounds like maybe not so positively. Approval ratings down?
That seems to be the trend, yes. International views are divergent, but overall, overseas approval seems to be slipping.
Any concrete examples?
Well, the sources mentioned a noticeable drop in U.S. tourism 10–15% annually, particularly from Canada. That's a tangible economic hit alongside the diplomatic cooling.
And specific allies. We heard Taiwan mentioned. Concerns there.
Yeah, growing distrust, apparently. A feeling that maybe U.S. interests are being prioritized in a way that could negatively impact allies. The unilateral nature of tariffs can make partners nervous about reliability.
Okay, now China. This seems huge. The trade war is actually changing public opinion inside China towards the U.S.
That's a really significant point. It seems the trade conflict has, perhaps counterintuitively, unified opinion against the U.S. Anti-American sentiment is reportedly becoming more mainstream.
So instead of blaming their own government for economic issues, the focus shifts to the U.S.
It appears that way, and this puts pressure on both sides in negotiations.
How so?
Well, for Beijing, backing down looks like weakness domestically, especially with this rising nationalism. You hear about this eat grass to win mentality online. People saying they'll endure hardship.
Wow.
And for Washington, a more unified, perhaps more hostile Chinese public makes it harder to negotiate concessions. It just raises the stakes.
And the official Chinese government rhetoric is hardening, too, this China doesn't kneel stuff.
Extremely strong language, yes. That foreign ministry video frames U.S. actions as pure bullying, saying China won't be forced into submission. Compromise itself is presented as almost undermining the party's authority.
So they're positioning themselves as victims of U.S. pressure, defenders of fairness.
That's the narrative they're pushing globally, yeah.
Right.
Which is ironic to some, given China's own actions towards smaller neighbors historically.
And we saw that commentary from Singapore, Lee Hsien-loong's wife sharing an article calling Xi Jinping's style like a gangster boss.
Right. That's a pretty blunt assessment from a usually quite diplomatic source, or at least shared by a prominent figure there. It shows just how sharp the contrasting views on China's leadership are.
Okay, so this potential U.S.-China decoupling. We talk job losses in China. What's the bigger strategic picture? Is China willing to take that hit?
The analysis suggests that while the economic pain and job losses would be real and significant, remember, they need the U.S. market, they need Western tech, the government might be willing to absorb those losses.
Why?
As part of a perceived long-term, protracted struggle with the U.S., they might see it as necessary pain in a larger geopolitical contest.
Yeah, this protracted war idea mentioned in state media, referencing Mao. That sounds ominous for relations.
It's deeply concerning, yes. It signals a potential shift to viewing the U.S. not just as a competitor, but as a long-term adversary. That's bad for relations, bad for global stability, and arguably bad for China's own continued opening up.
And some analysts think this strategy actually benefits the Communist Party internally, even if it costs jobs.
That's one interpretation, that a long-term confrontation helps consolidate power, even at significant economic cost. Their view of history, like still seeing the Korean War as entirely justified, also points to a certain worldview.
So China's digging in. What about other countries? Are they just picking sides or trying to stay out of it?
Mostly, it seems other countries are looking out for number one. They seem willing to adjust trade deals with the U.S. if it benefits them economically. And crucially, they're mostly not retaliating against the U.S. with their own tariffs.
They're adapting, not fighting back against the U.S. moves necessarily?
Largely, yes. Prioritizing their own economic interests in this changing environment.
And we saw the EU is also taking action against China, right? Tariffs on equipment due to subsidies. Planning more?
Correct. EU tariffs up to 6.7% on some Chinese equipment, citing unfair subsidies. And plans for tariffs on small-value goods, too. It shows this isn't just a U.S.-China thing. There's a broader reassessment of trade with China happening.
Okay, circling back to Taiwan quickly. They might be in the first phase of U.S. trade talks, but could also face tariffs. A 10% baseline, maybe?
That seems to be the expectation, yes. Inclusion in initial talks, but likely facing that 10% threshold tariff. Negotiations would likely focus on things like strategic procurement, compensation, reducing non-tariff barriers.
But there are still friction points, like U.S. concerns about Taiwan's agricultural barriers, pork and beef.
Yes, that's an ongoing issue raised in U.S. trade reports. Specifically, restrictions on U.S. pork and beef, like the ban on beef. Awful. The U.S. says the ban isn't scientifically justified based on BSE risk anymore.
And labeling issues, too.
Right. Criticisms about how U.S. beef and pork have to be labeled, which the U.S. feels puts them at a disadvantage in the market. These are long-standing irritants.
Okay, so we have the U.S. strategy, China's defiant response, other countries adjusting, internal pressures. It really boils down to that core question from the sources, doesn't it? Is China acting like a gangster boss, as that Singapore commentary put it, or are they being unfairly targeted?
That is the absolute heart of the debate, and different sources paint wildly different pictures. The U.S. points to trade practices, IP theft, subsidies.
As evidence of unfair play.
Right. While China frames it as the U.S. trying to unfairly suppress its rise, acting unilaterally. The gangster boss comment from Singapore shows how strongly some view China's approach.
And China paints itself as defending global justice, while simultaneously being accused of bullying its neighbors. It's a complete clash of narratives.
It really is. It highlights fundamental disagreements on how international trade should work, who sets the rules, and what motivates each side's actions. Who you see as right or wrong really depends on your starting point.
So looking ahead, what didn't we cover? What are the big unknowns we should be watching out for?
Well, a few things. What's the real long-term impact on global supply chains, beyond just the critical ones everyone talks about? How will other major players, Japan, South Korea, Brazil, react and adapt?
Good point.
Also, potential legal challenges. Could these tariffs get tied up in courts, domestically or internationally? And we need a much better sense of the impact on specific U.S. industries and, importantly, on you, the consumer, beyond the big picture statements.
Right, the ground level effects. So, wrapping this up, we've got these intense ongoing U.S.-China trade tensions, part of a bigger economic strategy from Washington. The world is watching, reacting, often critically, and where this all ends up, still very much uncertain.
Absolutely. It just shows how tangled trade, politics, and global economics really are. It's incredibly complex.
So here's the final thought for you to chew on. Given everything we've discussed, competing stories, the goals, the potential consequences, what do you think is the most likely long-term outcome here? Who ultimately pays the biggest price? And maybe more importantly, what new questions does this raise for you about how the world economy works and how nations relate to each other?
Lots to think about.
Definitely. Thanks for diving deep with us today. And don't go anywhere, because when we come back, we've got another really interesting topic lined up for you. I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it. We've got some really interesting and, frankly, pretty spicy commentary making the rounds about China.
Yeah, definitely.
It feels like the gloves are off in some corners, you know?
Yeah.
With comparisons being drawn to a gang boss and serious questions being raised about whether China can even integrate into what's being called the civilized world.
It's certainly a moment where some deeply held perceptions are being aired, and the language is quite strong.
Strong is one word for it.
It highlights the ongoing tensions and, well, debates surrounding China's growing global influence and how it's perceived by different actors. What's fascinating here is the intensity, really. The rhetoric, it really signals a moment of reevaluation for some.
Right. So, to get into the weeds here, we've got a couple of key pieces of information feeding this discussion. First up, an article shared by Ho Ching.
Ah, yes, wife of Singapore's former PM Lee Hsien Loong.
Exactly. This article doesn't pull any punches, basically saying that Xi Jinping's leadership over the past, 12 years?
12 years, yeah.
Has been straight out of a gang boss playbook, like Don Corleone style.
And the article, I think it's from Critical Spectator, doesn't just make that assertion. It lays out a series of actions and policies as evidence.
Right.
This isn't just a vague accusation. It's tied to specific behaviors the author believes exemplify this gang boss approach.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what specific actions prompted such a strong analogy.
Exactly. They're not shy about naming names and pointing fingers. The article highlights the imposition of the 9-dash line in the South China Sea as like a prime example. For those less familiar, maybe you listening aren't super clear, the 9-dash line is this vaguely defined territorial claim by China.
Huge claim.
In the South China Sea. Yeah, huge. Encompassing vast areas considered international waters by other nations.
Right.
The article calls its imposition a violation of international law and a clear grab for territory belonging to ASEAN nations.
It's that classic move, isn't it? Claiming a huge chunk of the map.
Yeah, and then building military installations on disputed islands, all while the neighbors are trying to fish or, just exist.
What's fascinating here is how this action directly contradicts the image, or the attempted image, of a friendly partner that China is now trying to project in Southeast Asia.
Oh, absolutely.
The article sees this charm offensive as, well, disingenuous, given the history of assertive, some would say aggressive, actions. It raises the question of whether actions truly speak louder than words in international diplomacy. Seems obvious, but...
Yeah, you'd think, and it doesn't stop there. The piece also slams China for being a supposed shining beacon of free trade, while simultaneously restricting foreign companies and seemingly ignoring WTO commitments.
Right, the World Trade Organization rules.
Yeah, those rules. Accusations of China ignoring these commitments raise concerns about fair play and, the stability of the whole global trading system.
It's the old do as I say, not as I do scenario, which, let's be honest, doesn't sit well with anyone trying to play fair in the global marketplace.
Not at all.
The accusations of protectionism are significant because they undermine China's narrative as a champion of globalization and free trade.
Completely.
If these claims hold weight, it suggests a disconnect between rhetoric and reality, further fueling distrust. It makes you think about the delicate balance between, national interests and global economic cooperation.
Then there's the whole Belt and Road Initiative. Now, On the surface, it looks like a win-win, right? Infrastructure investment for developing nations.
That's the pitch, yeah.
But the article paints a much darker picture, highlighting potential debt traps.
We've heard that term a lot.
And the dumping of cheap Chinese goods that can cripple local industries in places like ASEAN countries. It's like offering a helping hand that ends up pushing you underwater.
The concern over debt sustainability within the Belt and Road Initiative has been a recurring theme in international discussions. Definitely. Sure. The article underscores the potential for these projects to create long-term economic vulnerabilities for participating nations, raising questions about the true intentions behind these investments.
Right.
It's interesting to consider how the perception of these projects as debt traps impacts international relations, regardless of the actual long-term economic outcomes for participating nations. This highlights how narrative can be as potent as reality in shaping global opinions.
That's a really good point. Perception is reality sometimes. And Europe doesn't get a pass either. The article argues that China's treatment of Europe is just as heavy-handed as anything the U.S. has done.
Oh, interesting comparison.
Especially when you factor in China's support for Russia in the Ukraine war. That's a pretty strong statement, essentially saying China is siding against Western interests in a major global conflict.
By linking China's actions towards Europe with its support for Russia, the article frames China's global behavior as a consistent pattern.
Yeah, like a strategy.
A consistent pattern of challenging the established international order and Western alliances. It suggests a calculated strategy rather than just isolated incidents.
No, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. The article touches on this idea that just because a lot of people around the world might not be fans of someone like Trump,
right,
that doesn't automatically make Xi Jinping the good guy in comparison.
A false dichotomy.
Exactly. The point is that even though the U.S. might get flack, there's still, according to this article anyway, a general trust that they'll honor agreements.
Baseline trust.
The same can't be said for China, according to this piece, which has a reputation for not exactly playing fair with its partners.
This is a crucial point about trust and reliability in international relations. It really is fundamental.
Surely.
The article suggests that a track record of perceived unfair dealings can be a major impediment to building genuine global partnerships, regardless of the unpopularity of potential alternatives.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about the long-term consequences of eroding trust in international diplomacy. It takes ages to build, seconds to break.
So the bottom line of this gang boss argument seems to be that China's past actions, this perceived mistreatment of other nations, is seriously hindering its ability to rally global support, even against someone like Trump. It's like, sure, we might not love the other guy, but at least we kind of know what we're getting. Is that the vibe?
I think that's what the article's implying, yeah. It concludes with the sense that China has missed an opportunity to build true international support through consistent, trustworthy behavior.
Right.
The critique suggests a self-inflicted wound, basically, in China's global standing. It highlights the importance of soft power and the ability to build consensus in international affairs, not just hard power.
Okay, so that's the gang boss angle. Now let's shift gears a bit. So these gang boss accusations paint a picture of China acting outside established international norms. This naturally leads us to the related question of whether these actions, along with broader aspects of its political system and societal norms, contribute to the perception that China is difficult to integrate into what's often termed the civilized world. Now, that term itself comes with a whole set of baggage, right? What even is the civilized world in this context?
That's the crucial first question, absolutely. The term civilized world often carries a, let's say, Western-centric definition.
Yeah, usually.
Typically emphasizing the rule of law, individual freedoms, and a sense of civic responsibility.
Right.
However, it's essential to acknowledge that different cultures and civilizations have their own distinct values and definitions of what constitutes civilized.
Of course.
China, with its rich history and unique cultural traditions, certainly has its own understanding. It's not a monolithic concept.
Absolutely. It feels a bit presumptuous to just slap a Western label on the rest of the world and say, this is it. But, okay, the discussion seems to stem from observations about public conduct and the influence of the Chinese Communist Party's ideology. Let's start with this idea of collectivism versus individual responsibility. How might that play out in terms of, say, just basic public etiquette, queuing, littering?
Well, the argument is often made that in a collectivist society, the emphasis on the group over the individual might lead to less focus on personal responsibility in public spaces.
Okay.
things like queuing, maintaining public cleanliness. These might be seen as secondary to the needs or goals of the larger collective. However, and this is important, as the source material points out, many collectivist cultures like Japan or South Korea actually have incredibly high standards of public etiquette.
That's true. Very orderly.
Right. So this suggests that education and enforcement mechanisms are likely more significant factors than just the underlying ideology itself. It's not inherent to collectivism.
That makes sense. It's not necessarily that collectivism has to mean messy streets. It's about what values are prioritized and what norms are taught and enforced.
Okay, what about the role of state control versus individual civic autonomy? That feels like a big one.
Here, the argument is that in a system with strong state control, like China's, public behavior is often regulated by government rules. Think of things like the social credit system we hear about.
Right, that system.
While this can lead to certain desired behaviors, it might not necessarily foster a sense of intrinsic morality or self-regulation.
Ah, okay.
So when individuals are in environments with fewer external constraints, like traveling abroad, maybe their behavior might not always align with international expectations.
It's like if you're only being good because you might get points docked or a penalty.
Exactly.
What happens when the threat of penalty is removed? Interesting.
It's a question of internal versus external motivation, perhaps.
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
The sources also bring up the role of ideological propaganda in education. What's the connection there? Well, historically, the focus of propaganda and education in China has been heavily centered on patriotism, national unity, and economic achievement.
Makes sense, given their history.
Right. There might have been less emphasis on personal etiquette, intercultural sensitivity, or the responsibilities of being a global citizen, maybe. This could lead to a lack of awareness or understanding of different cultural norms and expectations when interacting with people from other backgrounds. It's not necessarily intentional, just maybe not the focus.
That makes sense. If you're constantly being told nation first, maybe the finer points of international social graces get a little lost in translation, so to speak.
Potentially, yeah.
And the sources also mention the legacy of the rural society at the time the People's Republic of China was founded. That's a pretty big historical factor, isn't it? Going way back.
Absolutely. In 1949, the vast majority of China's population lived in rural areas.
Right.
Levels of education were generally lower, and standards of public health and sanitation were quite different from urban or modern international norms. As people moved to urban centers during the rapid urbanization, and it was incredibly rapid, some of these ingrained habits and behaviors came with them.
Habits die hard.
They do. And changing those deeply rooted societal norms takes time and generations of education. It's a massive shift.
And then you throw in the Cultural Revolution, which sounds like it really shook things up in terms of traditional social norms, like completely disrupted things.
Oh, profoundly. The Cultural Revolution was a period of significant social upheaval that disrupted many traditional Confucian values and etiquette.
Right.
The emphasis shifted towards class struggle, and traditional social hierarchies and customs were actively challenged, even attacked.
Wow.
Rebuilding those social norms after such a period of disruption is a long and complex process. You can't just flip a switch.
It's almost like hitting the reset button on social behavior and then trying to piece it back together while simultaneously undergoing this massive economic and societal transformation.
Exactly. It's multiple revolutions happening at once, in a way.
Speaking of that, the sheer speed of modernization in China is mind-boggling. Going from, what, 20% urban to over 60% urban in like 40 years.
It's staggering.
That's got to put a strain on adapting to modern urban norms.
It's a scale and pace of change that's almost unprecedented in human history. The source material draws a parallel to the industrialization of 19th century Europe.
Ah, okay.
Where similar challenges in adapting to new urban environments and social norms arose. Overcrowding, sanitation issues, new rules.
Right.
It takes time for infrastructure, education, and individual habits to catch up with such rapid societal shifts.
And it's not like everyone in China is the same, right? We talk about China, but there are huge economic and educational gaps within the country. Does that play a role in these perceptions?
Absolutely. That's a crucial point the sources make. Many of the behavioral issues or perceived issues tend to be more prevalent in less developed areas and among more recent rural migrants to cities. The educated urban middle classes, who have had more exposure to international norms and standards, often exhibit behavior more in line with global expectations. It's not a monolithic picture at all.
That's an important nuance. It's easy to fall into generalizations, isn't it?
Very easy.
Now, what about some of the cultural factors that are specifically Chinese, like the emphasis on face or prioritizing in-group interests? How might those clash with Western concepts of public order?
Yeah, those are relevant too. The concept of face, or mianzi, which is about social standing and reputation, can sometimes lead to prioritizing the interests or appearance of one's own group or family over broader public considerations. Saving face or giving face is really important.
Right.
Similarly, a strong emphasis on in-group loyalty might mean that interactions with strangers or those outside the immediate circle are governed by different norms than those within. This can sometimes conflict with Western notions of universal public order and etiquette, where rules are expected to apply equally to everyone in public space.
It's like your loyalty lies with your close circle first, and everyone else is kind of secondary in terms of obligation, maybe?
It can manifest that way sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
And the sources even mention this traditional rural perception that public spaces aren't really anyone's personal responsibility to maintain.
Oh, interesting. Like, it belongs to everyone, therefore no one.
Kind of. If public spaces are not seen as something that individuals have a personal stake in maintaining, it can lead to different behaviors regarding cleanliness and upkeep compared to cultures where there's a stronger sense of shared civic responsibility for the public environment.
That's a pretty fundamental difference in mindset, actually.
It is.
So putting it all together, why do these perceptions of difficulty in integrating arise in the first place? It sounds like it's a tangled web of factors, not just one thing.
The perception is indeed a complex result of several interconnected factors. You've got the fundamental ideological differences between communism and Western liberal democracy.
Yeah, that's the big geopolitical one.
Which leads to scrutiny based on human rights and freedoms. Then you have the challenges in international image, which, as we discussed, can be amplified by media attention on isolated incidents of uncivil behavior by some tourists.
Right, those viral videos or stories.
Exactly. And underlying all of this is the slow but ongoing process of Chinese citizens adapting to international norms, a process that is definitely more advanced among younger, more globally connected generations.
It's almost like these isolated incidents get blown out of proportion sometimes and overshadow the broader trends of adaptation and change that are happening.
Precisely. Selective perception plays a role. And the sources also highlight the efforts being made at both the government and societal levels in China to improve public behavior and international image.
Oh, like what?
Well, policies promoting public etiquette, stricter penalties for certain types of uncivil behavior, and guidelines for citizens traveling internationally are all part of this effort.
So it's not like there's no awareness or attempt to address these issues internally. It sounds like it's a work in progress.
It is definitely a work in progress. The difficulties in integration or the perception of difficulty are not simply due to ideology or public conduct alone.
Right.
It's a complex interplay of history, culture, economics, and geopolitics. Improvements are being made, but building international trust and shifting deeply ingrained perceptions takes time and consistent effort. It won't happen overnight.
Okay, so to wrap this all up, we've really taken a deep dive into some pretty critical views of China today. We've looked at the gang boss allegations, which seem to be based on specific actions and a perceived pattern of unfair treatment on the global stage.
Actions like the South China Sea claims, trade practices, Belt and Road concerns.
Exactly. And then we explored the multifaceted reasons behind why some might see China as difficult to integrate, touching on everything from political ideology and historical context to evolving societal norms and cultural differences.
What's crucial to remember throughout all of this, I think, for us and for you listening, is the importance of considering multiple perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely critical.
International relations are rarely black and white, good versus bad. There are always nuances, historical contexts, and differing value systems at play. It's messy.
Absolutely. It's about moving beyond simplistic narratives and trying to understand the underlying complexities, even when the rhetoric gets really heated.
For sure.
So on that note, here's something to chew on as we finish up. How do our own historical experiences and differing cultural values really shape how we define civilized international behavior? It's worth asking ourselves that.
That's a great question.
And in this interconnected world, what role does perception itself, just the idea people have, play in shaping global politics? How powerful is it?
And maybe one more.
Go for it.
What responsibility do we all, individuals, governments, media, bear in fostering more positive and, perhaps more importantly, understanding global engagement?
Deep thoughts for the ride home, indeed. Lots to think about there.